Hi, everyone. It's Miss Cecil, and today what I want to do is focus on avoiding common errors that students make on the AP Human Geography exam. While I normally like to focus on the positive, if we see what mistakes students often make in the past, hopefully we can avoid those as we respond to the free response questions this year. So, this information is based not only on my own personal experience as a longtime reader of the exam and someone who's been involved in the leadership of the reading, but also the Chief Reader Reports. So, the Chief Reader Reports is a report that the person who's the chief reader, they're in charge of the overall scoring process of the exam, puts together each year to say, here's what students did well with, and here's where they struggled. And although the questions in terms of their specific content and skills vary year to year, we oftentimes see trends in terms of students making the same sorts of mistakes. That's what I want to talk about today and what I want to help you avoid. So, the first one's pretty basic. You have to know what the question is asking. If you don't know what the question is asking, how can you possibly have a correct response to that question? You can't. And so it's important that you take the time to read the question, interpret the question, break down what am I being asked to do here. And part of that is knowing the command verbs. So, am I being asked to compare? Am I being asked to define, describe, explain, identify? And I especially want to focus on compare, describe, and explain. So with compare, you might be asked to look at differences and or similarities. So pay attention to which of those are both that they want you to talk about. The other thing with compare is in terms of differences, you need to have parallel comparisons. What that means is that if you're dealing with, for instance, the differences between subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture, instead of saying commercial agriculture is where the crop is grown for a profit, whereas subsistence agriculture does a lot of the work by hand. Those two statements separately are correct, but they're not comparing exactly the same thing. So instead, you want to deal with, let's say, that commercial agriculture uses a lot of machinery, whereas typically subsistence agriculture does a lot of the work by hand or with simple tools and is less mechanized. That's what I mean by parallel comparisons. So be sure that you do that if you're given a compare question that focuses on differences. The other big thing with differences is sometimes students will want to say, well, this particular thing does this. And then for the other side, they'll say, and this one does not. Okay, so what does it do instead? So, like for instance, with the commercial and subsistence agriculture example, instead of saying commercial agriculture is focused on growing agricultural products for a profit, whereas subsistence agriculture is not, I would change that is not to whereas subsistence agriculture is focused on the consumption of those agricultural products within the family as opposed to making money on them as the primary goal. So that's what I mean by the compare parallel differences. Define, we do pretty well with, that's pretty self explanatory. But describe. So describe's another one where you can't just write a word or two or just a short phrase. So if I say, I'm going to describe myself, teacher, that really does not provide a clear description. So instead, it's supposed to be relevant characteristics of the topic. So you're going to make a claim, like what are the relevant characteristics of whatever I'm being asked to describe, and then you're going to support that with evidence. So it should be multiple sentences. Similarly, with explain, you know that my favorite word when we're asked to explain is because. You should have some sort of because statement. So, this particular thing is happening. Here's why it is happening and how. Here's the cause and effect of this. And I encourage you, when you think that you've finished explaining, to go one sentence deeper. And again, this should be multiple sentences. And then identify we do pretty well with just indicate or provide the information that's specified. You're not going to provide elaboration or explanation there. The problem is what if I'm asked to explain and I define? Well, then I'm not going to get that point because I'm not going to touch upon the content that's required. So, know what I'm being asked to do. This is a direct quote from the Chief Reader's Report last year. Students need to learn to close the loop in their writing. Many students introduce good ideas, but fail to tie their ideas back to the question or fully explain the connection to what the question was asking. So, in other words, you might have great content, but if you're not answering the question that was asked, that doesn't matter. And sometimes you think you are, but you have to make that connection. You have to tie it in for the reader. You have to do that work. You have to do the heavy lifting, not the reader. So if the reader's having to connect things for you, that's a problem, and that's going to result in points not being awarded. That with a little bit more detail explanation, that closing the loop, you could do that just fine. The other thing, and this, a lot of these go back to understanding what the question is asking, is you need to identify the scale of analysis in the question. Is it global? Is it regional? Is it national? Is it local? Because that's going to impact the manner in which I talk about things. So if it's a question about a local process and I start talking about general global processes, that's a problem. I'm not answering the question that's asked. And again, that's going to negatively impact me acquiring points for my response. Now, when you're looking at the scale of analysis, global's on here, but it's probably not going to truly be global. So even if you're shown like a map of the world, you're not really, though, looking at the whole world in terms of how the data is broken down. You're typically looking at a world regional context or maybe the national context of this country versus that country. So how is the data displayed on that map if there's a map or a chart or something like that that's displayed? And make sure you're talking then about that right scale of analysis. The other thing, and again, this also ties back to just breaking down what is the question answering or asking, is to identify the context of the question. So, are we in an urban context or an agricultural context? Are we talking about more economically developed countries or less economically developed countries? I need to make sure that I'm talking about things in the correct frame, or it's going to totally change my response. And of course, change the potential points that I can earn for the response. So make sure that you get that context down. That's why you should always do some pre-planning and brainstorming and ask yourself these things ahead of time as opposed to just immediately starting to write your response. The other thing is to be specific. So there are two kind of ways to be specific. If you're asked, what sort of pattern is occurring, and you're like, well, birth rates are high here, low here, that's too vague, especially if you're given a map that shows the actual data breakdown. You need to make sure that you are using as much specificity as you can when you're asked to describe things. The other thing is, and we saw this happen in several questions over the years, but students will talk about there are different cultural groups. Okay, so you should know some of the different aspects that distinguish cultures from each other, such as language, potentially religion. How are they different? Right? So this is where oftentimes students don't give us as readers enough information. So tell me more. You're not going to be penalized for being too specific. Similarly, avoid vague pronouns. If you're talking about it and they, and I don't know who it and they are referring to, that's a problem, and that can make your answer incorrect. The other thing is to understand all sides of the course content. Make sure that you understand the advantages and disadvantages for all the major concepts in the course. So, like the Green Revolution, it definitely had a lot of advantages, but it also had some significant disadvantages. make sure that you understand both sides. When we're looking at models, what are the strengths of the models? What are the weaknesses? So the world is complex. You should understand that these global and local processes that you've learned about are complex, and that there's not just a one-sided sort of response. So you should be prepared to address all sides of any of the concepts in the course. The other thing is that you should be able to differentiate between political, social, environmental, and economic factors. So if I'm asked for an environmental factor for something, an environmental impact, and I say something about it harming the economy, that makes no sense and doesn't, again, answer the question that's asked. And so I'll repeat myself. Most of this goes back to understanding what the question is asking of you and then making sure that you stick to that. When you're being scored on a standardized rubric like you are on the AP exam, there's not that forgiveness for changing the question that some of you are really good at doing in individual teachers' classrooms. So some of you will take an essay question and you'll really change the question to a totally different question, and you'll write so well on it with so much accuracy and detail that perhaps you'll be awarded points. On the AP exam, since it's on a standardized rubric, it really has to address the specific question that's asked, not the question that you wish was asked. So you're actually better off doing an okay job answering the question that's asked versus doing an amazing job answering a question that wasn't asked. Stay focused on the question that is asked. And oftentimes, it's not consciously changing the question that you're doing. Instead, it's just that you failed to spend the time thinking about the question, processing it for a minute because you were too anxious to start writing. So take a moment, breathe. You'll have time. You don't have time to stare at the walls or anything, but you have time to think and process. Take advantage of that time. And then know the vocabulary for the course. But reciting a definition, that's a start, but that's not enough. You have to know how to apply those terms in a geographic context. This was also something that came up in every single chief reader report since the exam began, is that students were not familiar enough with the terms in the course. So make sure that you've gone through, make sure that you know those terms, but make sure that you can do more than just recite a definition. Also, be careful with reciting definitions. Make sure that it's in that geographic context, and make sure that you have translated into words that you understand. An example that you might remember that I used in class earlier in the year is that since my children are adopted from Russia, is that I memorized some phrases, some Russian phrases before I traveled to Russia for the first time. And so I was able to communicate with people by using those phrases. The problem is that I didn't understand the language. So I would communicate with these phrases I had memorized, but the people would respond, and they usually didn't respond with one of the few phrases that I knew. So I had no idea what they were talking about. Sometimes that happens to students in human geography too. They've memorized a list of vocab, they don't really understand it, they can't apply it, and so it's the same as speaking in a different language that's not understood. You have to learn the language of geography. So make sure that you're solidifying your understanding of these terms and concepts over these next few weeks. And that is it. Those are the most common ones. Again, most of it goes back to one issue, not breaking down the question and understanding what the question is asking enough. So hope that helps you avoid some of these common mistakes, and I will talk to you soon.